no one prior to the Romans, and indeed perhaps no one after the Romans, developed such elaborate rituals for acquiring land, holding land, and disposing of land as did the Romans. Now that trickled into Europe, and you had in medieval Europe, even in feudal Europe, private ownership of land, of which we could not find at that time anywhere else in the world. The principle which dominated politics and economics in medieval Europe was one enunciated by the Stoic philosopher Seneca, a Roman philosopher, which is very brief and very succinct and very much to the point. Kings rule as subjects own. And medieval kings could not deprive their subjects of their property, because if they did, and some of them tried to do it, and they even succeeded, they were regarded as tyrants. They had no right to take their properties away. Now, the importance of private property for liberty and civil rights is well illustrated an example of two European countries at extreme ends of the continent in geography as well as constitutions. England, the most westernmost country in Europe, and Russia, the most easternmost. In England, land becomes private property very early in the Middle Ages. Scholars have found that already in the 13th century, 12th century, you had trade in land. I mean, they were commodity. They were not just something that belonged to the king, but belonged to the squires. Nominally, when the Normans conquered England, all the land belonged to the king. But in fact, it was not so. The Norman kings were expected to pay for all their expenses, court, military, and so on, from their own rents. But by 1300, they no longer could do so. So they had to convene what became the House of Commons. The House of Commons was an embodiment of the principle of private property in England, because the king could not impose arbitrarily taxes. Taxes had to be approved by the owners, and the owners sat in the House of Commons. So that was really the beginning of limited monarchy in England. If the king wanted to tax, he had to have the House of Commons approval. And that's why Burke, I cite him in my book, said that the liberty in England was won by taxation. Because our taxation could not be arbitrary. It had to be approved by the owners of the property to be taxed, as it is, of course, in our country. So gradually, the kings forfeit their power to the commons. By the end of the 17th century, of the Glorious Revolution, Charles I was executed, among others, because he taxed without permission of the House of Commons, imposed taxes without them. By the end of the 18th century, the English king really made no difference whether he was ruling or not ruling. I mean, George III was insane, very insane, and he ruled for quite a time, and yet it made no difference. England waged wars in America, waged wars against Napoleon. The king was totally mentally incapable. So we have this case in England of freedom, constitutional freedom, being won by respect for the right of property. And something like it, though not always quite as clearly as in England, also occurred on the continent. In France, in Scandinavia, in Poland, and elsewhere. Parliaments were largely convened in Europe, and almost all European countries had parliaments, although sometimes were suspended for a while, because they alone had the right to give, as they were then called, taxes but subsidies, to the kings. So the king needed money, and they always did. They had to have parliaments. And as a result of this, parliaments gradually acquired more and more power. Now in Russia, the process was very opposite. There was private land in Russia in the early Middle Ages, but then in the 13th century, the Mongols conquered Russia and ruled it for almost 2.5 centuries. And they imposed a tribute on Russia. And the Mongol Khans, as they were called, had considered the whole land to be theirs. They could impose any kind of tribute on it, any kind of tax on it that they wanted. They could give it to anybody they wanted, or take it away from anybody they wanted. And when Russia liberated itself from Mongol rule, which was at the end of the 15th century, they adopted the same system. That is to say, the Russian Tsars felt that all the land was theirs. They handed it out on condition of military service, and only on that condition. So if somebody did not perform properly military service, or couldn't perform it, then the land was taken away and given to somebody who could or would. And thus there was no private property at all. Hence there was no need for parliament in Russia. You had a couple of institutions that some people say are like parliament, but they had no real authority, and certainly had no authority over the king or the Tsar, what taxes he could collect and what taxes he must not collect. Only at the end of the 18th century, due to the fact that the throne in Russia was assumed by German princess Catherine II, who was familiar with private property, that private property was introduced into Russia in land. 1785, land was given in property to the landlord who held it. And from then on, you had in Russia private property, first in land and then in other commodities. But the fact is that it never really struck root in Russia. And this is the reason why the communists in the early 20th century could seize power so easily and liquidate all private property in Russia. Because Lenin and not Stalin, but Lenin and Trotsky abolished all private property, everything was nationalized. The result being that the entire population was subject to the whims of the government. You could have no liberty in the Soviet Union because everybody, almost everybody, 99.9% of the population, were paid wages by the government. So if you were an engineer, well-paid engineer, or journalist, and you dare to criticize the government, you ended up digging ditches. And that was a real source of the power of the Soviet regime. It was not the secret police. Of course, it played its part too. But the complete economic control over the country that gave the Soviet government such power. In Nazi Germany was different. Nazi Germany respected private property, although it was also a totalitarian state. But that is largely because private owners, particularly industrialists, collaborated with the Nazi regime, and it wasn't necessary to confiscate it. So you had private property in Nazi Germany throughout the Nazi regime, though always conditional, that you serve properly the state and provide it with its goods. Here is a quotation from Hitler from 1920s. I want everyone to keep the property he has acquired for himself, according to the principle, the common good takes precedence over self-interest. Now, if you can see a logic here, you have a better mind than I do. I don't see the logic of this at all. But the state must retain control, and each property owner should consider himself an agent of the state. The Third Reich will always retain its right to control the owners of property. That was Nazi Germany. He didn't have to really implement this principle because the German people collaborated with the regime fully. Well, so much for the historical background, and I just want to conclude to say that I'm worried about the expansion of state power in regard to private property. And we have various, in the last chapter of my book, I show the various ways in which the modern state, the welfare state, the American state, which is not the welfare state yet, can actually control private property and in this way enhance its powers. Through rent controls, through minimum wages, through affirmative action, the government actually can enhance its powers tremendously. In most of Europe, in the early modern era, 16th, 17th century, the state controlled at most 8 or 10% of the state income. Today, in the United States, it's 35%, and in Europe, it's 50%. And given what I've said about the importance of private property, it worries me whether eventually we will not see the state becoming more powerful and liberties vanish. Well, I'll stop here and expose myself to questions.
Thank you.